All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Pat Spain. Welcome to the show, Pat.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you rescheduling. We had this horrible storm last week, and you were kind enough to put us back on your schedule. So I'm really glad that you're sitting down with us, man.
Yeah, very glad to be here. And glad that we're not getting a crazy storm right now. I think Massachusetts is going to get hit tomorrow. So we're right in that
You,
window.
you and me both. I am glad. We've had some crazy weather here in North Carolina, but thank God I think we're on the other side of winter and it's starting to warm up a little bit. So I think we're in our last cold snap and we're going to come through the other end. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about you. Some people may not know who you are. So let's
Mhm.
start with the basic stuff and tell everybody who you are and talk a little bit about your career. I know you've done a couple of shows on television. We want to hear all about that. So why don't we start there and give everybody sort of a baseline for who Pat Spain is?
Sure. I think a lot of people don't know who I am, but I appreciate the optimism there. So I am. I went to school for marine bio. I'm a biologist. I've always been a biologist. I've always been fascinated by wildlife. When I was a little kid, I was catching and raising venomous snakes and poisonous spiders in my basement, lying to my parents about what they were. I was going around and helping birds and helping just about every animal you can think of. Was especially the creepy crawly ones. Those were my favorites. So if I could raise, frogs and toads and salamanders and crayfish, that's what I was doing. When you're the crazy guy in a field holding a rattlesnake, you tend to get a crowd gathered around you. So I embraced that. And even as a kid, I would go door to door and knock on my neighbor's door and ask if they wanted to hear about whatever animal it was that I was holding. And most of them would kind of humor me and go with this. But, this is before the internet. So the only people I could share it with were those that were in front of me. So I loved doing this, and I kept going right up through school. In college, I was a teacher's assistant, and after I graduated, I realized that biologist street performer doesn't really pay the bills too well, or at least didn't at the time. Now it does, amazingly, but I still wanted to do this. So when my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, when we would go on vacation, I would end up giving these impromptu talks. So I'd give a speech here and there. We were in Costa Rica and I'm catching, I'm finding a fertilance or I'm catching glass frogs. And I'd end up just talking to the people who were around us. We're supposed to be on vacation, but this is what I'm doing. And my wife said, you should really try to get a name for yourself here. Try to reach an audience so that people know, well, you are crazy, but they know that you're not dangerous crazy. So, because I know how much you love doing this. So I started doing wildlife TV. I auditioned for a show on Animal Planet called King of the Jungle 2. It was a reality show. And I had a great time filming it, had a lot of fun, and realized that this was something I really wanted to pursue. So I formed my own crew. We started a web series called Nature Calls, self-funded, self-directed, self-produced, everything all on my dime and my time with a couple really, really good friends of ours. And I did that show for about 6 years. In that time, I spent every dime I have and got myself crazy in debt, but had a lot of fun doing it. Then started getting some calls from networks. And I did a series. After 6 years of that, I did a few pilots here and there. And then I finally got a series on National Geographic called Beast Hunter. And Beast Hunter was a cryptozoology, biology travel series where I went lived with all different indigenous peoples and learned their customs, traditions, and their stories about legendary creatures. Used my knowledge of biology and of cryptozoology to kind of make an assessment about this creature. Never looking to prove whether it's there or not, but more the anthropological, like, why is this important type of thing, and what other animals display the characteristics that people are describing. So had some crazy adventures all over the world, and did a few other pilots here and there, and then I did a series on Travel Channel called Legend Hunter. That was, sort of crypto, sort of investigative journalism, get into a little bit more, just into kind of a different realm. And I did that right up until the pandemic. And then when travel was shut down, I wrote some books because I'm a little bit crazy.
So I definitely want to get into the books, but you have had so many adventures. There's a couple of things that I have on my list to talk about. And one of those things is I've been bitten and stung by almost anything that you can think of. So tell us some of those stories. Tell us what crazy adventures you've had and what has been What have you been bitten and stung by?
Well, it's honestly, it's a long list, and it is on my resume. So I do, on my actual resume, I have the list of things that have bitten and stung me. I mean, as a little kid, I was fascinated by all these animals, and part of that was, I didn't even have what I'd call a healthy fear. So I would grab them, they would bite me or sting me, and then I'd go, "Hey, why are you doing that?" And kind of go from there. So it's been everything from a black bear to a whole bunch of different types of snakes, all kinds of snakes you can think of, from pythons to a rattlesnake to a couple different what's it called? All the local stuff, pretty much anything you can find in Massachusetts. And then the stings, it's been bullet ants, it's been harvester ants, it's been siafu ants, it's been all the different wasps and pretty much every hymenoptera, everything you can think of like that. And mice, rats. Yeah, the worst bite I've ever had was from a rabid raccoon. That was really bad. So I was 21, living down in Maryland, doing oyster research down there, and I'd been having a water fight with my friends all day. So it was just a bunch of 20-year-olds goofing around on an internship. And I thought I was laying on a picnic table, reading a book, shirtless, getting some sun, and I thought one of my friends was sneaking up on me. So I heard this noise, and I just kind of put my book to the side, and I leaned down under the table and went, "Ha!" And I just saw a set of teeth jumping at my face. So I instinctively put my arm up like this to block, and this huge raccoon, just an absolutely massive beast of a raccoon, latched onto my arm and locked in, where its jaw, the teeth actually went behind my bone. So it got stuck on my arm like this. And I started screaming, and it started snarling, and there's spit and blood and everything flying everywhere. And I picked it up off the ground, and I started yelling at it, and then I hit it on the picnic table a couple times to get it to let go. So finally, this thing drops to the ground, and I'm just gushing blood out of my arm. And it's looking at me. I'm looking at it. I kicked it a couple times. It's staggering away. The classic rabies, like very, very clear. My friends are watching me from in the window of the house that we're living in. And as soon as it's gone, they come rushing out, and they're like, "Are you okay? Is everything?" I was like, "Yeah, you guys can laugh now. It's fine. Let's go to the hospital though." So I get my arm all wrapped up. I've got a whole bunch of puncture wounds in the arm. And I get to the hospital and find out that I have to get rabies shots. So they're hot pink. You get the shots in the shoulders, in the thighs, in the butt, and then in each one of the bites. So they have to take these shots and put them in the bite and circle the needle around while they're giving the shot so it's completely covered. It's the nurse's first day on the job. I'm the first person she's ever given these shots to. So as she's doing it, she kind of hit the bone a couple times because the bites were deep. So she's doing it, and I'd flinch. Ugh. So every time I flinched, she started crying. So I ended up rubbing her back, going, "You're doing a great job. This is okay. Just take a breath." And then I had to go back the next day and get another, dozen shots, and a couple days after that, and a few months of those shots. But I'd like to say that I'm invincible to animals now.
God, that is crazy. That's like my worst fear ever is being bit by a rabid animal. That can't be fun for sure. And I've heard horror stories about the shots themselves. So
Yeah, well, it used to be really bad when you got them in the stomach. My uncle got bit in the head by a bat when he was a teenager, and he had to get the shots in the stomach. So I was glad they don't do that anymore. But it was a lot of shots, a huge series of them.
so I'm always curious to know if anybody, some people may not be familiar with bullet ants. I've seen them on television and they don't look like something I would want to cross paths with. So, how in the world did you get stung by bullet ants? How did that come to be?
So bullet ants have the worst sting in the world. They're the second largest ant. They're huge, and they call them bullet ants for two reasons. They're about the size of a bullet, and when you've been stung by one, it feels like you've been shot. So the late Dr. Justin Schmidt developed the Schmidt Pain Index, which is the list of insects with the worst sting, and he put them at the very top. That was the worst sting in the world. So I had worked with bullet ants a few times down in Central America when I was filming different things, and I was going to be filming with this tribe in Brazil called the Satare Mawe, and they tend to have a distrust of outsiders, a very rightful distrust of outsiders. They have been treated very poorly, like most indigenous peoples have around the world. But I wanted to show them respect, and I wanted to show them that, I was somehow worthy to hear their true legends. And I wanted to, really develop this sense of trust with them, but do it quickly because we only had 14 days to film. So I came up with the idea of, what if I do the bullet ant ritual? And the production company that I was working with said, absolutely not. There's no way you can do that. That's a terrible idea. People have died from one sting. We don't know how you're going to react. We don't know what the threshold is. You can't. I said, well, what if I could? what if we talk to some experts? So we talked to Justin Schmidt. We talked to a few other entomologists. We talked to some people, and got clearance. I had to sign my life away, but finally got clearance to do this ritual. And the bullet ant ritual involves being stung in your hands hundreds of times by bullet ants. So you go into the forest and collect them. Then the ants are knocked unconscious and they're woven into these gloves. I have one of the gloves. I can go grab it. And they, when they wake up, they're not very happy. And they then, if you're an initiate in the tribe, they put the gloves on your hands and you start just getting stung over and over and over again while the tribe sings and you dance for 5 minutes while you're getting stung by these ants. And then you go crazy.
God, that sounds horrible.
It was unreal. Just the most intense pain you can imagine. And it goes and builds and builds and builds for about 5 hours, and then it peaks and it stays there for about the next 19 hours.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit about this. Is some in my wheelhouse, at least I would like to think so, with the interest in Sasquatch and Bigfoot. And
Sure.
I believe that there's a possibility that I was maybe bluff charged by something in the woods that could have been a Sasquatch when I was 12 years old.
Oh, man.
You've been charged by a silverback gorilla. How did that come to be, and what was that like?
Silverback gorilla, elephant, a few other things. That the silverback was wild. So we were in the Central African Republic filming with a troop of gorillas that was not habituated to humans, but was comfortable enough to most of the time allow someone to be in the general vicinity of the troop. So this is not a tame group. This is a wild group of gorillas. But a local pygmy tribe had been working with gorilla researchers, and over about 3 years had developed the ability to, 6 times out of 10, they could get within, visual distance of them and not get, absolutely decimated by these gorillas. So we go through all this training and learn everything that you can and can't do. And then start walking through the woods to find this group of gorillas. Well, one of the things that you're never supposed to do is to get between a female and the baby. So we come up over a ridge, and where am I? I'm between the gorillas and their babies. So luckily, it was okay. They were touching my clothes, touching my pants. They're that close to me, kind of walking around just this whole troop of wild gorillas. And then the silverback notices, and he is, just a massive, terrifying creature. So stay and watch him for a little while. Everything's fine. I mean, he goes 60, 70 feet up a tree effortlessly in seconds, goes up the tree, throws down a whole bunch of leaves, and then just climbs down and drops to the ground like it was nothing. So we're with him for about an hour, and then start walking, and the troop kind of takes off. So we're like, no, we're going to follow them. So we're walking and walking and walking. And all of a sudden, the male, to our knowledge, out of nowhere, just turns and charges at us. And your life just flashes before your eyes. I mean, these huge canines, mouth open, snarling, splashing, hitting the ground, running after you. And instinct kind of kicks in. All the training goes out your head immediately. And all I thought of was, I need to look like the smallest, weakest thing in the world and let him know that he's the toughest. That's what I did in high school when the football players picked on me. That's what I'm going to do now. So I kind of just curl up and just like get down and start like pretending to eat grass or something on the ground and just, doing nothing. So he grunts another time, splashes, and then, gets a few feet and turns and runs away the other direction. And what it turned out, we found out later, is that the silverback has a harem of females. So, his purpose in life is to protect them. And he needs to maintain this posture and this toughness and strength. And he needs to, an iron grip on this group. And he was getting a little bit older, and there was another male in the area. And one of the silverback that we were with, one of his harem checked out the other male, like glanced over his shoulder and was looking at the other male. So in his mind, he lost face in front of us. And he thought, like, oh, maybe people won't respect us. So he took the female and slammed her against a tree and then charged at us. And I mean, we just hear her scream. We see him freak out and then see him charge at us. And yeah, it was wild.
Wow. Let's talk about this pit of 200,000 snakes. This was one of the things that stuck out to me on the list among a few, but can you tell us how that went and what that was all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 200,000 number is a little bit, finger in the air. So I have read any reports from 40,000 up to 400,000. So I picked a number in the middle and I went with it. I just want to scientifically throw that out there that that's what happens. So this is the largest concentration of snakes on Earth. It's in Manitoba, Canada, and every spring, these snakes emerge from their winter dens. And you get just this absolutely massive wave of snakes that pours out of the ground. I mean, as you're watching it, it just, you see 100 snakes, and then 5 minutes later it's 500 snakes, and then it's 2,000 snakes, and they just keep coming out of the ground in waves. They're rolling down hills, they're forming mating balls, they're climbing up trees and falling out of trees, they're flowing like a river. You can reach in up to your shoulder in snakes and lift your arm up and just let them run down your arm, all covering you. And I had spent the last year and a half recovering from stage 3 colon cancer. So right after we finished filming Beast Hunter, I was diagnosed with colon cancer, and I had a whole bunch of complications, dozens of surgeries, in and out of the hospital for about a year, chemo, everything else. And I needed to do something where I'd feel like myself again. So I called 2 of my best friends and said, hey guys, I really want to go up to Manitoba and film, for Nature Calls, do a web show up there. And one of them immediately, he goes, we're going to do the snake dens. And I was like, yeah, we're going to do the snake dens. He was like, I'm in, let's do it. So we got in my car and drove 34 hours straight up to Manitoba. I got permission from the Canadian government. I got all the, did all the paperwork, everything you need to do. Went up there on my birthday. And I laid down in the middle while the snakes poured in over me. We filmed for 2 days, jumped back in the car, drove back to Boston.
What kind of snakes are these? I'm curious. Is it a certain type of snake? Is it just a mixture?
They're mostly red-sided garter snakes. That's the largest concentration. But because the dens are shared, there will be other types of snakes mixed in there as well. But it's pretty far north, so it's just about the furthest north of the red-sided garter snakes range, and they're about the furthest north snake. So you could get, there's a couple venomous that may be in there, but in May when they're first emerging, nothing's looking to bite you. I didn't get bit by a single one while we were up there.
Gotcha. This was something that really stuck out to me as super cool. It's something I would love to do. Going down 1,000 feet underwater in a submersible. What was that like? How did that happen? Where was this? We got to have the details for that for sure.
Coolest thing I've ever done. Hands down, no doubt. Coolest thing I've ever done. It was off the coast of British Columbia in the Agamemnon Trench. And this was back in 2010. So the pilot of the sub told me that there had been less than 500 people at that time that had ever done this, which was amazing. So I went to school for marine bio. I'm a huge marine bio nerd. My dream was to be able to go down into the depths and to really, see the creatures in their own environment, see them down there. This was something that I'd always wanted to do and never imagined that I'd have the opportunity. So we were doing an episode on sea serpents. And the associate producer floated the idea kind of as a joke that, hey, do you know there are actually these private 3-person subs that you can rent and they will take you down? They're like, it's an absolutely exorbitant fee. It would blow our budget, but how cool would that be? And I heard it and went, yes, we're doing that. Like anything else that we need to cut, I was like, I will live on power bars. I will drive the car. I don't need a hotel room. Like cut everything out of the budget to make this happen. And I think more just to get me to stop talking about it than anything else, the production company agreed to it. And it was unreal. It was, we were down there for a couple hours And it's just a world like you can't imagine. It is the most alien landscape you can believe. It's the one of the only places I've ever been where humans truly aren't supposed to be there. We really, really are out of place when you're down there. I've never experienced darkness like when you're there, and then when you turn the lights on, every animal you see is fascinating. Everything, every squid, every squat lobster, every tube worm, everything you see is just unreal. And it was a dream come true for a marine bio nerd.
It sounds like it would be the same thing for a person like me. I'm an introvert by nature. Cliff Brackman and I were talking about it last week on the show. We're both sort of professional extroverts. So if I could go down 1,000 feet in a sub with maybe one person or two people, I would be in heaven, or in outer space. I'd be okay with that too. But
I would love that too.
the only problem for me is I'm claustrophobic and I'm scared of heights, but I love to fly. It's this really weird dichotomy that I live with, but that sounds like an amazing adventure. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this, but I didn't even know this about you until I started researching you for the interview. You are the grandnephew of Charles Fort. Is that correct?
I am, yeah. So great, great, great grandnephew, I think is what it is. So my grandmother, Harriet Spain, when I was growing up, I was always a weird kid, as you can imagine. And she would kind of laugh and say, "You're just like your Uncle Charlie." And I had no idea who Uncle Charlie was, but I assumed this was a family friend or someone, he wasn't at the regular barbecues, so I didn't know who this guy was, but apparently he liked weird things too. So this went on for years, for my entire childhood. And it wasn't until I think I was in high school. I might have been a senior or maybe a freshman in college, but I was reading the Book of the Damned. And my grandmother saw me and said, "That's your Uncle Charlie." I said, "Who's my Uncle Charlie?" And she was like, "Charles Fort. That's your Uncle Charlie." I went, "No way." And she went into their back room and she brought out a whole bunch of, first editions of his books that are signed by him and made out to different family members, and old tintype photos of him and all this other stuff. And I was shocked. And then I really dug into it and really just embraced this connection, because that was the stuff that I was into also. I mean, he writes about sea serpents. He writes about these anomalous phenomena. He writes about raining fish and ball lightning and all the stuff that I was fascinated by as well.
Well, you went on to write books. We've mentioned it a couple of times. You've gone on to write several books. I think you've got 6 books at this point.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that. How did that process start for you? What was the process like? I'm always curious. I'm actually thinking about writing my own book. So I'm really trying to push myself in that direction. But how did that start for you? Was it just something that fell in your lap? Is it something you've always wanted to do? Can you talk a little bit about the process, and then we'll get into each one of the books?
Yeah, so it is something I've always wanted to do. Absolutely. I love writing. I love just kind of storytelling in general. And I've had these great adventures and I've given a lot of talks about them. So I've spoken everywhere from, my niece and nephew and now my kids' kindergartens all the way up to NASA. I gave a speech at NASA a few years ago, and that was just blew me away. I mean, I told stories about pooping in front of a pygmy village to a bunch of NASA scientists. So talk about like, oh, you're the dumbest guy in the room. I was the dumbest guy in that room by far. But so I love giving these talks, and I've had people say, you should write it down. You should write it down. And it's one of those things that I always wanted to do. And then when I got sick, when I was diagnosed with cancer, the heads of the production company that I worked for, Laura and Harry Marshall from Icon Films, know that I'm essentially a golden retriever. I always need to have a job. I need to have something that I'm doing. So they sent me a laptop and said, "Write your books. Start writing these adventures. Start writing them." And I said, that's not a bad idea. So I started then, and I kind of worked on them on and off over the years, and then finally got serious about it in about 2019. And I pitched them around to a bunch of different publishers. Finally found a publisher who liked the style, liked what I was going for. I had some publishers who wanted me to make them a lot more inspirational or heartfelt. And I was like, I just kind of want to tell funny stories. That's really what I want these to be. I want these to be funny, true travel stories and with a crypto angle. And this publisher totally got it. But they said, "What have you written so far?" And I said, "Well, I've written almost 800 pages. They're like, "That's way too long." I was like, "Yeah, I know. I know that's way too long for this book." And they said, "Well, let's start cutting it down." Then the pandemic hits, and the publisher that was this is perfect timing. I mean, nothing about the pandemic is good or perfect. I will not, nothing. But this is the timing. So the publisher said, we've read it. We don't think we can cut anything. What if you actually wrote more and we made this a 6-book series? And I said, okay, well, what would you like to hear more of? So they gave me some places to beef up and some new stories to tell, and pulled some stuff out of me that I had forgotten about. And we ended up making it 6 books. And that was my pandemic project. And they were just released in January and February of this year, all 6 books.
Well, let's talk a little bit about each one. I don't want you to give away the entire book, but can you talk a little bit about, let's start with the Mongolian death worm. That was one of the things, actually, I went up, we were talking a little bit before we went on air. I went up and filmed a documentary for Tubi that's coming out. And that was one of the things I thought I was going to get to talk about, but they cut it out. So I didn't get to talk about the Mongolian death worm. So let's talk a little bit about each one of these books and sort of the adventure that went behind that. Let's start with the Mongolian death worm. Where did that come from, and how did that get on your radar?
Yeah, so greatest name in cryptozoology, hands down, the coolest. You say that, everyone wants to know more. So, and that's really how it got on my radar. I read about the Mongolian death worm, and I was like, oh man, I got to know more about this. Roy Chapman Andrews, Indiana Jones, yeah, let's dig into this. And then the more that you find out, the more exciting it gets. So, it spits acid, it blows itself up, it shoots hot blood, it can electrocute you. It's got all this crazy superpowers, and it sounds outrageous. But when you break it down and you start to really dig into biology, you see that there are animals that do everything that's described there. So when we were working on Beast Hunter, the production company and I met a lot and made our list of cryptids that we wanted to target, and said, here's my top 10, here's their top 10. Let's talk about these and let's see where we align. So we got our top 10. We then brought that to Nat Geo and said, okay, so out of these 10, which 5 are you most interested in seeing? And they picked 5 of those, and the Mongolian death worm was one, luckily. So we went out to Mongolia and all over the Gobi Desert, and the adventures were bizarre. It's a wild place. I found a nest of dinosaur eggs on the ground, just hanging out, like wandering through the desert. Our car broke down. Our car was sparking and flaming from the dashboard while we're driving. You're literally in the middle of nowhere. I was catching snakes and catching tons of lizards and making homemade vodka at night. Eating sheep's knuckles and drinking mare's milk and eating cheese curd and all this bizarre stuff all over the Gobi, and just had an amazing time with it. And the book really tells that. It just tells the insane stories that you get into when you're, trapped with a group of people, living in yurts, they call gur, living in a gur, and, heading out in the desert where it's, 112 during the day and freezing cold at night. And you're covered in ticks most of the time and using the most disgusting bathroom you've ever seen in your life.
It definitely sounds like a good time to me.
I loved it.
One thing that really stuck out to me is something that I was interested in. I think my first cryptid love ever was probably the Loch Ness Monster. Nessie was always something that fascinated me, still does, honestly, as an older gentleman now. But you got a book called Sea Serpents on the Hunt in British Columbia. What were you looking for there, and what if anything, did you find?
Yeah, well, Nessie, first of all, I filmed a pilot of a series for Sci-Fi on Nessie, and I've had 2 other pilots almost make it through on Nessie. So that's one that I would love to get up there again. It's beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. If you've never been, I highly recommend it, even just for the haggis and cider. It's worth the trip. But the sea serpents were, it's one of those things that as a marine biologist, this is something where I don't feel that it's even controversial to say that there are large undiscovered animals left in the ocean. That's something that even conservative scientists will agree with. So when you say that you're looking for a new giant creature, people kind of go, 2023, I don't know. And then you go, oh, in the deep ocean. And people go, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. And that was really the premise of this, was what is the, so the First Nations tribes up in Canada, what do they talk about when we hear sea serpent? What do they describe? So we met with a man named Hal Simal, and the Snuneymuxw people, and got the kind of history of sea serpents from them, what they were describing, what they were seeing, and it doesn't 100% line up with what people think. So it really raised this great kind of paradox, or something in my mind, where it's the unfortunate. Ooh, sorry, hit the audio there. It's the unfortunate thing about cryptozoology, I think, where unless you find the exact animal that someone has in their mind, then they're not going to believe that you found it. So if we find a new species of deep sea squid that occasionally rises to the surface to feed, it lives in deep water, but it comes to the surface at certain times of the year, or it's following a certain prey species, or it's more likely to go for birds than other types of cephalopod, I would be enthralled and love it and be so excited, and most of the world would go, it's not a sea serpent. And that's really what I was trying to do with this book, is show you just how bizarre the oceans are, and what animals we know about, and what animals we are likely to find that could explain a lot of the sea serpent legends. We found, a giant lion's mane jellyfish while I was down in the sub. We found some amazing, shore creatures, and sea otters, and other really cool stuff, and saw swimming deer and things that can be mistaken for this, and really just got to put together the fact that everyone I interviewed, every scientist, everyone at Woods Hole, everyone that I spoke with, that we did a scan of an oarfish, which is another thing that could be mistaken for sea serpents. It was the first scan that had ever been done of an oarfish, and they told us that at least 3 dissertations were going to be written about the scan that we did, which was amazing. Found a completely new form of mobility that they have in different digestive. Yeah, it was really cool. So we got to do that, and the book really talks about what other possibilities are out there. So I kind of lay out every type of animal that might be mistaken for a sea serpent, and just talk about all the weird stuff that's in the ocean.
A living dinosaur on the hunt in West Africa. Everybody's fascinated with dinosaurs, right? So what's that all about? What tell us a little bit about what we can expect in that book.
So Mokele Mbembe is one of those classic stories from the Victorian era, where it really, really got popular in the kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, where you started hearing these stories from darkest West Africa of the dinosaur that's been found there. And if you're going to describe anywhere in the world where there could be a dinosaur, that's the place that you're going to go to, because very few people in the West have been there, and very few people in the West know that much about it. So, and then you get these stories. So our entire basis for this was in 2006, there was a population of over 100,000 gorillas found in West Africa. So no one in the West, no one in the scientific community knew that these animals were there. And then, there's one classic kind of aerial survey, and they find them. So if 100,000 gorillas can be hiding in this forest, then what else could be there? That was the basis for the expedition into that region. So there have been sightings throughout history. There have been, some video footage that isn't too compelling to me, if I'm being completely honest, but certainly an interesting region of the world. And what I found when I went there is a fascinating history, and more of a study in anthropological myths and stories and legends than in biology. And that's still exciting to me and still great. What I found is that the Baka and Bayaka pygmy tribes are who is classically associated with Mokele Mbembe. They have the stories and the legends, and they have the most sightings. And in these groups, toughness is respected above all else. Strength and toughness and bravery. So if you were to say, I don't want to go down to the river at night because there are crocodiles down there, you'd be looked at as weak. If you say the river is running too strong for me to go fishing today, you're looked at as weak, even though most people who are fishermen can't swim and are on these little sampans, these dugout canoes. But if you say, I don't want to go down to the river tonight because I saw Mokele Mbembe there, people go, oh, that's a good move. That's smart. Yeah, don't do that. So it's almost this culturally accepted out. It's a way to not engage in reckless unnecessary behavior without being looked at as, as weak or as, not brave.
Gotcha. Well, here's the big one for me. Obviously, this is what everybody comes to talk about on Sasquatch Odyssey is Bigfoot and a little Bigfoot on the hunt in Sumatra. I'm assuming we're talking about the orang pendek. Is that what we're talking about as far as that goes?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how that came about and some of the adventures you had there.
So orang pendek has been spotted throughout history. You get everything from pre-colonial days, stories and legends from the local tribes, to the colonial period to present day, where people are spotting this. And honestly, I went in, which I now realize is such an arrogant attitude. I went in thinking that this was most likely mistaken identity for either an orangutan or a gibbon. Gibbons look weird when they're on the ground. They want to be in the trees. They do occasionally run on the ground, but they don't want to be there. They look weird. When orangutans get really old, they call them spirit animals because they look so strange. Their fur naturally dreads and gets really long. The males get these huge face plates, and they get so big that they actually can't climb trees anymore. So if you see one of these old orangutans, and that was my assumption, was that was what was being seen. After visiting there and seeing it, I was wrong. I really do believe that orang pendek, a small hairy hominid, was either there very, very recently or may still be. I think, unfortunately, if they are still there, they're older individuals that are slowly dying out. And the reason why I say that is the eyewitnesses that we talk to, they have this dichotomy of the spirit world and the real world, and tigers bridge that divide. So they're really, really, really interested in tigers, and they want to talk about tigers all day. And if you ask about any mundane animal, they'll kind of they're like, yeah, that's cool, but let me tell you about these tigers. And when we asked about orang pendek, it was, yeah, that's cool, but let me tell you about tigers. So this was just another creature. But they would say, well, my grandparents saw them more often than my parents, and they saw them more than we have. I've seen one or two. And they're like, the weird thing, now that you're asking about it, because it just, isn't a big deal to them. A lot of animals are going extinct, unfortunately, in Sumatra and in Indonesia. But they say, the weird thing is, I've never saw a young one. My parents used to tell stories about the young ones, and they would da-da-da-da-da. I've never seen a little one. And as you're piecing it together, you kind of go, all right, well, as a great ape, as a hominid, it's probably long-lived. If it is nocturnal, which is all the evidence points to, and it doesn't have a home range, it's more of a wanderer. Gorillas, orangutans have more of a home range, or gorillas are more wanderers. If this takes that even further, gibbons kind of wander pretty far. The longer lived animals that are wanderers, that travel great distances, they exist in small numbers to begin with. You start to kind of build this biological image, and you go, okay, well, what would push an animal to do this? You're like, well, there are tigers in Sumatra. The tigers in Sumatra don't generally attack humans. What if being bipedal gives you that advantage, makes you associated with humans to the point where maybe you're not going to have the predation? So that's, an evolutionary driver to a more upright gibbon-like creature, and then the body structure, everyone that describes it. I do think that Lauren Coleman probably gets it right when he talks about having there be multiple different animals that we call orang pendek. After talking to Dr. Mike Morwood, who was the gentleman that first described the hobbit, the Homo floresiensis, he truly believed that Homo floresiensis, or a similar creature to Homo floresiensis, was around at least until the 1920s. And when I asked him, do you think that this could still be there? And he's like, oh, there are 17,000 islands in Indonesia. Yeah, I absolutely think that they could still be there. And that would be much more human-like than, what I was thinking of orang pendek. Also, talking to the locals, I mentioned right up front that I think I went in with a very arrogant attitude, and I think most Western scientists, unfortunately, have that. I was told straight up by one of our guides. He kind of laughed when I was asking him about gibbons, and he goes, look, the only people who don't believe in orang pendek are the people who've never been to my forest. I was like, all right, it's fair. That's yeah, I'm here for 2 weeks. How am I going to tell you what you've seen? And he's like, I know gibbons. I know, like, I've seen a lot of gibbons in my life. You know, you've seen a dozen. I've seen thousands of them. So, yeah, I left there truly convinced that this is a real creature.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because the Homo floresiensis, because I had a conversation with a guy. The show has not aired yet. So his name is Pete. He's from Australia. I do not remember what country he was in when I talked to him, but he wasn't in Australia. And he was in the military over there. When he got out, he started doing contract work and he went down to the Solomon Islands and was there on a mission several times. And he kept running into locals that were talking about these, I can't remember, I think they called them Uma or something, that were these 3 meter tall, hairy, upright, bipedal, huge ape like creatures that people were coming in contact with in the forests. And his first time he set foot in this particular area, this particular village he was in, this kid comes out from, he'd been out collecting something in the woods and he's scared to death. He's kind of white and he's saying he's had this encounter with this thing. And it's interesting that Pete started looking into this. And when he finished up, he actually traveled back over there because he was very curious about what people were seeing.
Yeah.
And he himself had 3 encounters with what he believes to be a hobbit or Homo floresiensis. And I found that very curious. And he actually, during the conversation, we had this conversation about what he was seeing and what these other people were claiming to see. He said, I don't believe they're seeing these 3 meter tall or 9, 10 foot beings. He said, I think they're having more, maybe a meter tall, because what he saw was about 3 feet tall. Mm-hmm. And in the moment, they're having the fear and the adrenaline, and they're sort of magnifying, like you said earlier, you know, people kind of see and hear and what they want to see and hear when they're having these kind of encounters.
Sure.
So it's just interesting that, and this was, I mean, within the last couple of years, we're talking here. So people are still encountering these things. And obviously, you said maybe even to this day in Sumatra. I mean, what do you think about that? We talked a little bit about it as far as the sea creatures and things like that, and the undiscovered large species probably still out in the sea that we have no idea about. What do you think the chances of something like, let's bring it to America and talk a little bit about Sasquatch and Bigfoot? Mm-hmm. So, I've never had an encounter, right? And I do an encounter show. I've had experiences where I think it could have been something like that here on our property in North Carolina. But I tell you, I'm 300 plus shows in, and I've talked to a lot of people who claim to have encounters with these things. So they're definitely having experiences with something. So again, the question, long-winded question is for you. What do you think the chances of something like that really being out here and to this very day in 2023 in North America?
So Sumatra, I have no problem believing that there are large undiscovered creatures left in one of those, thousands of islands all over Indonesia. In the United States, there's still a lot of wild areas. There's still a lot of places out, you go out to Montana, you go out in Northern California, some of the places that I've been, you would be very surprised to find a footprint, to find a person's footprint. Or, I say that there's a lot of places in the world where you probably won't bump into someone, but you wouldn't be surprised to find a cigarette butt. Well, if you go up into Northern Canada, you'd be surprised to find a cigarette butt. You'd be surprised to find any evidence of humanity being there at all. And I think that lends some credence to it. I think there's also the fact that people say, well, everybody's got a cell phone. Everybody's got, we can record, we can take photo. Yeah, but when you're hiking through these areas, how readily available is your phone? I've tried to do this. So when I was in Sumatra, they put me up in a tree with 2 cameras ready to go. Perfect, great cameras ready to go. And I was sitting completely stock still for hours. And they said, just take a picture of any animal you see. I heard a troop of gibbons. I heard them go all around me. I saw a whole bunch of birds. I saw a whole bunch of stuff on the floor, some, little agouti-like creatures and other things like that, the Indonesian equivalent. I didn't get a picture of a single one of them. And that's while I'm sitting stock still with my camera. So I don't think that that argument really sways me that, oh, we'd have pictures of it. No, you probably wouldn't. Um, but I haven't done enough of my own research to really say one way or the other where I am on Bigfoot. I mean, I respect Jeff Meldrum a massive amount. I've heard the Sierra sounds. I've heard that the talk, and I've heard the gentleman talk who recorded them, and I've heard the sound, the calls themselves. I think it's fascinating. I have no all of my experience in the woods and all the animals that I'm aware of. I can't place that to any creature. You know, there's sometimes you hear a Bigfoot call and you're like, oh, okay, that's a red fox, or that's a screech owl, that's a barn owl. That's, you know, but when you hear the Sierra sounds, I don't know what that is. I think that that's really good evidence. I think that there's new tools that we have now, like eDNA, where I think that the more expeditions that we can do, the more eDNA samples we can take, the more the trail images that we can take and drone footage, the more likely we are to get answers to these questions. I do think there's something that people are seeing. I haven't been out there myself. So I guess long-winded way of saying I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't say that it's impossible, but I'm not wholly in the camp of, this is absolutely 100% there, just because I haven't been there.
Exactly. I think that's a very fair answer. And Cliff and I got into the what if they are real. He's convinced. Cliff has had a couple of sightings and he's seen these things through thermal, and he's convinced 100% that they're real. And he believes they may be some sort of Australopithecine. I know a lot of people get on the Gigantopithecus bus. We don't even know if Gigantopithecus was bipedal, right?
Or had ever made it this far. And yeah.
Exactly. There's a lot of what ifs and maybe nots and what have you. But I mean, is there anything that you can think of that would point you in either direction of what these things might be if they exist?
Yeah, I would not go with the Gigantopithecus. Just all of the anatomical features that we know about Gigantopithecus, which is pretty minimal. To be fair, we have very, very few bone fragments, but it all points to it being much more ape-like than upright. Much the head being much lower. More aligned to walking on four rather than walking upright. There is a really fascinating hominin that was found fairly recently. I want to say since 2015, from somewhere in Southeast Asia, that at least to me gets kind of exciting because it showed that it was not in the trees. I wish I could remember the name of it now, but it was. Oh boy, I'll find it. And I'm going to kick myself later. But it all of the anatomical evidence showed that it was upright walking and was tall and kind of met a lot of the characteristics of what we would think of with Bigfoot. It was not an Australopithecine. And I really can't remember it, and it's gonna drive me nuts. But I just read this great book on human evolution that's available for free on Audible. Anyone who's on Audible, and it just really blew me away. I mean, it's definitely, it's not a Bigfoot book. It's a true like human evolutions book and talking about all the different recent findings. But I looked at it from a cryptozoologist perspective, and I found a few really cool points like that.
So, where is the best place for people to get your books? Do you have anything that you're working on currently that you want to tell everybody about? And where can people find out more about you?
So I have a website, patspain.com, and I am fairly active on Instagram. That's really the only social media that I can keep up with. I'm 42. I can't do anything beyond that. So so they can find me on there. The books, most people are finding them on Amazon, and that's great. You can order them from any of your local bookstores as well. They probably don't have them in stock, but they'll order them for you. And Amazon has them readily available. And so there's 6 of them. And let's see, Pat Spain, what am I working on now? I'd love to keep writing. So I have a few ideas for the next round of books. I'm taking a little bit of time in between right now. And, I've got 2 young kids and having a great time. I say that when I was traveling a lot, I was a generalist. I knew a little bit about most of the animals around the world, and now I am an extreme specialist on my backyard. So in my few acres of land here, I can tell you every species of everything. I can tell you when they're breeding, when they're hatching, when they're, where to find them at what time. And I love that. I'm really enjoying that.
That is awesome. Pat Spain, thank you so much for stopping by and telling everybody your stories, man, and letting us live vicariously through your travels. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on, man. I've had a blast talking to you.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.